conquered the known world. Egypt, Persia, the edge of India, more territory than any single man had ever controlled in the history of the ancient world. And now, his generals were filing past his deathbed one by one, asking the question none of them could avoid any longer. Who gets all of it? He was 32 years old. He had a pregnant wife and a half-brother, unfit to rule alone. He had not named an heir. He had not built a system of succession. He had spent 13 years in motion, always forward, always the next campaign, always the next horizon. And he had never once looked back long enough to plan for a world that did not have him standing at its center. And now, the room was full of the most dangerous men alive, each one waiting for his answer. He gave them one word: Kratostoi, to the strongest. And then he died. Within 20 years, every person who shared his blood would be murdered by the men who had once followed him across the world. The empire he built in 13 years would not survive for even 20. Not weakened, not reduced. Gone, carved apart by the very generals who had helped create it. Killing each other and each other's families in a decades-long bloodbath that makes most palace intrigue in history look restrained by comparison. But before we can understand how Alexander's empire collapsed so completely, we need to understand something that most retellings of this story skip entirely: how fragile it was underneath the surface, even at its absolute peak, and why the signs of what was coming were already visible long before that deathbed word was ever spoken. Alexander inherited the throne of Macedon in 336 BC at age 20, after his father Philip II was assassinated at his own daughter's wedding, stabbed by one of his own bodyguards, in circumstances that remain disputed to this day, with suspicion falling on figures disturbingly close to Alexander himself. It was, from the very first moment, a throne built on violence, and Alexander secured it the only way he knew how: by executing potential rivals within his own family, almost immediately after taking power. What Philip had left him, though, was extraordinary. The most advanced military machine in the ancient world, the Macedonian phalanx, armed with sarissas, spears roughly 18 feet long, twice the length of anything Greek city-states were fielding. Combined with cavalry tactics Philip had spent 2 decades perfecting, Alexander did not invent this army. He inherited it. What he brought to it was something else: a willingness to take risks no rational commander should have survived, and an almost disturbing consistency in being right about them. In 334 BC, he crossed into Asia with 40,000 men. What followed over the next 11 years is still difficult to fully explain. At the Battle of Issus in 333 BC, he personally led a cavalry charge directly at the Persian king Darius III, not toward the flanks, not to exploit a weakness, but straight at the king himself, through the center of a larger army, in the kind of move that should have ended with Alexander's death before it ended with Darius fleeing the battlefield in his own chariot. The humiliation was total. Persian morale never fully recovered from the image of their king running. Alexander captured Darius's mother, wife, and daughters in the aftermath and treated them with a calculated respect that was itself a form of psychological warfare. A message broadcast across the entire region that this new conqueror was more restrained than the king he was replacing. At Gaugamela in 331 BC, outnumbered by a Persian army that ancient sources claim was several times his size, he won so decisively that the largest empire on earth ceased to exist as a political entity within days of the battle. He took Egypt without a fight. The Egyptians, so eager to be free of Persian rule that they crowned him pharaoh on arrival, told him he was the son of a god, and watched him make a detour deep into the desert to visit the oracle of Siwa, where he reportedly asked a question he never fully revealed to anyone, and emerged more certain of his divine parentage than when he arrived. He pushed through Persia's heartland, through Bactria, through mountain ranges no Western army had ever crossed, He married a Bactrian noblewoman named Roxana, a move that shocked his own Macedonian officers, who had not signed up to watch their king marry into conquered territory rather than simply rule over it. He began requiring Persian court customs among his own men, including ceremonial prostration, bowing before the king, that many of his Macedonian generals found degrading and alien. He was no longer simply conquering the Persian Empire. He was starting to become part of it. And the men who had followed him from Macedon were beginning to notice and to resent what they were watching. And then, in 326 BC, on the bank of the Hydaspes River in what is now Pakistan, something happened that no enemy had ever managed to make happen. His army stopped, not stopped by a superior force, not stopped by an impassable obstacle, stopped by exhaustion, by monsoon rains that had gone on for weeks, by the terrifying rumors of even larger kingdoms and even larger armies waiting further east, and by men who had followed Alexander across 3 continents without complaint for years and had simply run out of whatever internal resource makes human beings keep walking toward the horizon when home is thousands of miles behind them. They sat down. They refused to move, and the greatest conqueror in ancient history retreated to his tent for 3 days, refusing to speak to anyone, before finally, furiously, agreeing to turn back. It was the first time in his entire life that Alexander had been forced to accept a limit he had not chosen himself. And what he chose to do next reveals something essential about the man underneath the victories. Rather than take the easier coastal route home, he insisted on marching his army through the Gadrosian Desert, a wasteland of sand and heat in what is now southern Pakistan and Iran. Partly because ancient sources suggest he wanted to prove it could be done, to surpass legendary commanders who had attempted it before him. It could not be done, not without catastrophic cost. Historians estimate the army lost more men to thirst, heat, and starvation during that march than in any single battle in the entire campaign. The man who had never lost a battle managed to kill more of his own soldiers in a desert than any enemy sword had ever managed in 13 years of war. He arrived in Babylon in 323 BC, commanding an empire spanning 3 continents. He was 32 years old. He was already planning new campaigns: Arabia, the Western Mediterranean, Carthage. He was reorganizing administration across territories that had barely been held together long enough to be organized. And he was, by every account we have from people who knew him, increasingly unrecognizable as the man who had left Macedon a decade earlier. His closest friend, Hephaestion, had died of illness months before. Alexander's grief, according to ancient sources, crossed into something closer to collapse. The attending physician reportedly executed. Every horse in the army shaved in mourning. An entire city's temple demolished as punishment for a god he blamed for failing to save the one person whose loyalty he had never needed to question. He was surrounded by generals who had begun, quietly and carefully, to wonder what would happen to all of it once he was gone. They would not have to wonder for long. The fever came quickly. The accounts of his final days vary enough across ancient sources that scholars still argue about the cause. Poison has been suggested. Recurrent illness, acute pancreatitis, typhoid complicated by everything else his body had been through. What the sources agree on is the progression. Days of mounting weakness, a voice that faded until he could no longer speak. Generals filing past his bed, seeking guidance he could no longer give. His answer, kratis stoi, to the strongest, may or may not have been his actual final word. Ancient sources were not above retroactively shaping a death scene for maximum meaning, but whether he said it or not, the word perfectly describes what actually followed, because here is what Alexander had actually built underneath the map that made him famous. Not an empire in the way Rome or Persia understood the term, but a personal conquest administered by personal friends, held together by personal charisma and personal victories. There was no unified bureaucracy spanning the territory. No shared religion binding the populations together. No system for choosing a successor. No integrated aristocracy with a stake in the empire's survival as an institution rather than as Alexander's project. Remove the one man, and there was almost nothing structural left to hold the pieces in place. His generals, the Diadochi, the successors, understood this immediately. Perdiccas, appointed regent for Alexander's unborn heir, attempted to hold the empire together as a single entity. He was assassinated by his own officers within 2 years. Ptolemy seized Egypt almost immediately, and then, in one of the most audacious political moves of the entire period, hijacked Alexander's own funeral procession. Diverting the body meant for burial in Macedon, installing it in Egypt instead, using the conqueror's corpse as a trophy designed to transfer Alexander's legitimacy to whoever controlled his remains. He was not mourning his former king, he was mining him. And then came the killings that revealed just how little Alexander's memory was actually worth to the men invoking it. Roxana had Alexander's other wife, a Persian princess named Statira, married to Alexander in a symbolic mass wedding meant to fuse Greek and Persian nobility. Murdered and thrown down a well within days of his death. Alexander's mother, Olympias, orchestrated the killing of his half-brother's wife and child in a power play for her own grandson's claim to the throne. Alexander's half-brother, briefly a figurehead co-king, was executed not long after, and Alexander's son, the boys every general had sworn to protect, the heir the entire succession crisis had officially been about, was murdered around 309 BC on the orders of a man who had once served his father. He was approximately 13 years old. His mother Roxana was killed alongside him. Within a single generation, every direct blood relative of Alexander the Great had been eliminated. Not in battle, in the dark, by the men who had built the empire with him. By 301 BC, at the Battle of Ipsus, fought between former comrades who had once stood shoulder to shoulder under Alexander's command, the empire was formally, permanently divided. Ptolemy held Egypt. Seleucus held the eastern territories toward India. Cassander held Macedon and Greece. Lysimachus held Thrace. 4 kingdoms carved from one man's conquest, immediately spending the next century fighting each other. Even these fragments did not settle easily. Cassander's line was extinguished within a generation. Lysimachus died in battle against Seleucus in 281 BC. One of the last surviving men who had actually marched into Asia with Alexander, killed by another. Of all the original successors, only Ptolemy's dynasty in Egypt proved durable enough to last. And even that line would not end peacefully. Its final ruler, Cleopatra VII, watched her kingdom absorbed into Rome roughly 3 centuries later. The last fragment of Alexander's world finally swallowed by the next empire to rise. 20 years. That is how long it took. 20 years from Kratostoi to permanent fragmentation, from the largest empire on earth to 4 rival kingdoms, none of which were what Alexander had built, and all of which were fighting each other with his name still on their lips as justification. He could have prevented it. A single clear sentence on his deathbed. A named heir, a designated regent with real authority. Any structural plan for continuity might have changed everything that followed. He chose not to give one. Whether that was because the fever took him faster than expected, because he genuinely believed his empire would hold through sheer momentum, or because some part of him had never imagined a world that would have to function without him. Historians have argued about it for 2,000 years. The empire's collapse suggests the answer was all 3. But here is where the story refuses to end as pure catastrophe, and where Alexander's actual legacy finally separates itself from the empire that failed. The kingdoms his generals built did not abandon what he had started. They spread Greek language, Greek architecture, and Greek philosophy across territory stretching from Egypt to the borders of India, creating a hybrid civilization. The Hellenistic world that would go on to shape mathematics, science, and medicine for the next 3 centuries. The city of Alexandria in Egypt became the greatest center of learning in the ancient world. Its library attempting the same total inheritance of human knowledge that civilizations like Cordoba would reach for centuries afterward. Greek became the common language of trade, philosophy, and administration across the entire Eastern Mediterranean. A linguistic inheritance so durable that the New Testament would eventually be written in Greek. In territory, Alexander's campaigns had first opened to that language generations before Christianity existed at all. The same qualities that made Alexander's empire impossible to sustain. The relentless forward motion, the refusal to consolidate, the total conviction that the next horizon was more important than securing the last one, were precisely these qualities that spread his cultural influence so wide that it could not be collected back even after the political structure collapsed. He conquered faster than any administrator could follow, and in doing so, he scattered something that proved far more durable than the map that made him famous. A world in which Greek ideas had taken root in Persian soil, Egyptian stone, and Bactrian mountain valleys, growing into something no army and no succession crisis could fully uproot. The map vanished in 20 years. The world underneath it never fully returned to what it had been before he arrived. That is the thing about men who move too fast to plan for what comes after them. They don't build empires. They crack the world open, and what grows in the fracture outlasts everything they intended to leave behind.